Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.
Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Welcome to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. I'm Jean Till, and on today's show, we're visiting with Dr. Bud Marr, the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Science, and for today's show, a Newman Scholar, as we discuss the potential of John Henry Newman being named a doctor of the church.
So Professor Marr, very much a friend of Iowa Catholic Radio.
Very much.
He and I have not actually had much chance to sit down, so I'm looking forward to this. Jean, you and I are sparing our listeners the singing of the 12 Days of Christmas.
Shoot.
But hopefully people are continuing to abide in that. And, just as Advent was abbreviated a little bit with Christmas falling right after the fourth Sunday, here we are with facing this Sunday's Feast of the Epiphany, followed by the baptism of the Lord the day after, and then we move right into ordinary time. So we should savor this. I'm always one to try not to have too many Christmas parties during the Advent season, if there's any freedom there to have those scheduled. So I was basking after the somewhat poignant Mass that I celebrated this past Sunday, the Feast of the Holy Family at Holy Family Church in Council Bluffs, kind of marking the last public celebration of the Eucharist there as we begin to look at what is God asking of us. This has been a part of a process of discernment, of engagement with people who, parishioners, longstanding family traditions there, the sacraments and the grace is given for decades there at that church. But as God calls us to be a people who are continually on the move, discerning the signs of the times. And so Corpus Christi Parish, a very vibrant parish, but the sense that the church is beyond, transcends the walls. So we celebrate our last Mass. We'll look at what God might ask of us in terms of not just converting it into some kind of juice bar or something like that,
right.
but knowing that those treasures that are there, we will be good stewards of that. So the Feast of the Holy Family, a poignant occasion, some sadness, but also that intrepid looking forward to a vibrant time where God will continue to guide us, not in the desert, but to springs of living water. The other feast this week, so on January 1st, we know the Feast of Mary, Mother of God, was not a holy day of obligation. And then gathering with priests and seminarians, hosting them. Believe me, I'm not doing the cooking, Jean. Beth Stiver brings her wizardry, where she can just whip up a few little light bites for 50 hungry men, in the close quarters, maybe with a TV or two on, with a bowl game in the background. But I think, our seminarians get to see this fraternity among the priests. And then the following day, the January 2nd, the Feast of the Cappadocians, Gregory of Joensen and Basil. But the permanent deacons and their spouses, we hosted them at the house. So a lot of joy and frivolity, but also just the bond of faith and just hanging out with each other. It was a blessed occasion indeed. So looking ahead, today, the 5th, the day where bishops from around the Mink region, Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, Kansas, Region 9 of the USCCB, are making their way west to Prince of Peace Abbey in California, their traditional site for our bishops' retreat. There have been wonderful hosts over the years, and this year we're privileged to have Archbishop Terence Prendergast, of the retired Jesuit Archbishop of the Archdiocese of Ottawa, Cornwall in Canada. So the weather hopefully has been favorable for him to get out of Canada and head to a warmer clime. But he'll be feeding us his spiritual wisdom and nuggets. He's been preparing assiduously. He's going to talk to some degree about the Gospel of Mark, the current liturgical year in which we find ourselves. So a chance to be together, much silence, the celebration of these feasts, and then transitioning to ordinary time. Also, just again, we think about the kind of complex where Iowa Catholic Radio is. We had an open house and ribbon cutting for the Vitae Clinic this past Tuesday, too. So
as they're growing.
Much happening as we go forward. So a lot to celebrate. Jean, you, I hope, had marvelous times here, and you're gonna be free of me for a little bit here for a while. So try not to have too much fun in my absence.
What? I'll just sit at home wallowing in loneliness from my bishop.
Right. Yeah, you and John are in so many different places, so many venues at St. Teresa's Parish, and of course, being grandma is one of the key things.
Absolutely, and love grandkids, but you get to send them home because that's why children are meant for the young, right?
There you go.
Oh, it was a good time, though. Hey, we're going to take a quick break, and when we return, we'll be visiting with Dr. Bud Marr, the Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Science. And for today's show, a Newman Scholar, as we discuss the potential of John Henry Newman being named a Doctor of the Church. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network. Welcome back to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. And on today's show, we're visiting with Dr. Bud Marr, Dean of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences, and a Newman Scholar, as we discuss the potential of John Henry Newman being named a doctor of the church.
Now, I don't know if there's a fundamental tension, Dr. Marr, and you're well known to Iowa Catholic Radio listeners. You need no introduction from me, but that tension between being a dean and being a scholar, those two are like oil and water sometimes, aren't they?
Yeah, God has plans for us in life, and I've been called to be a dean at this time, but some days I do look back nostalgically, actually to graduate school, where in graduate school, you're thinking more about paying the bills, but your schedule is more open-ended than life as a dean. So it's a little bit different these days.
Yeah, well, as a board member of Mercy College of Health Sciences, I'm grateful you accepted this calling and responsibilities to kind of see that. Yeah. You're not a bioethicist. You're not a clinical health professional in that way. But the opening the souls and the hearts, that the formation is truly the whole young person, maybe not so young person, and you just had a pinning ceremony for a group of young people going into the health field, those essential workers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're grateful for the relationship with the diocese. A lot of good things going on at Mercy College. I'm not a bioethicist by training, although in my roles there, that's a hat I've put on. Mm-hmm. It's really been exciting and fascinating to get into that field. A lot of crucial issues, and I think the church has an important witness to give in this day and age. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And, a little bit, you're a native Midwesterner, we're at Mercy College, then felt the call to move to Pennsylvania and Pittsburgh, a tremendous city. But what were you doing there before you came back west?
So in my theological studies, I looked at the life and work of John Henry Newman. So my dissertation was actually on Newman's understanding of the church. And in 2017, I got an invitation to go out to Pittsburgh. It was a wonderful opportunity for me. Out there, there's a center. It's called the National Institute for Newman Studies, generously funded by Catholics who have a devotion to St. John Henry Newman. And there's a research library there, a chapel. It's right in the heart of Pittsburgh, connected to Duquesne University. But scholars can go there and spend time. There's actually apartments that open right up into the library. Spend time reading and researching there. But it's not this arid intellectual place. They're very committed.
Not just a think tank.
Yeah, a think tank. It's very committed to Newman's seriousness about committing our hearts to God and to Christ. And so there's a life of prayer. We've mentioned on our show, Bo and I, on The Uncommon Good, that the NewmanReader.org has all of Newman's writings online. So just many great resources through the Institute.
Oh, no, that's marvelously accessible. And I need to avail myself here, too. I think of Newman, probably more popularly known for the Newman Centers around in the United States and maybe other venues as well, kind of sponsoring the campus life and spirituality of college students. But how did this was that something that the Cardinal himself envisioned, or that was kind of appropriated as his legacy was distributed?
Well, one of Newman's most prominent writings, or what he's still very well known for today, are a series of lectures that he gave on the idea of a university. And so Newman he was the founding rector, or the first rector, at the University of Ireland, a Catholic school in Dublin. And during his time there, he also gave these presentations on what does it mean to be a university. And those are read by Catholics, of course, and Newman scholars are very interested in them. But even today, educational theorists look back to those writings, and Newman's thought still kind of permeates the conversation around what does it mean to be a university. So Newman had a heart for education. He talked a lot about personal influence, that education is not simply about disseminating like a group of ideas, but it's about forming a person. And so it can only be done through this personal encounter between a mentor and his mentee. Because of his passion for education, what he wrote about that, here in the United States, as Catholic centers were founded on college campuses, the leaders at the time thought, well, it's only appropriate that Newman would be named the patron of those Catholic centers. So it's pretty cool because when you talk to people, even those Catholics who don't have like this really deep understanding of Newman and who he was, many of them think like, well, when I found faith or when I came back to the faith, it was under the influence of Newman through his intercession and sort of under his shadow in a positive sense of the term.
Marvelous, whether it's at in Ames or Iowa City or Omaha, University of Nebraska, Omaha. These are vibrant centers that continue to really awaken young people, I think, again, to their faith in a much more mature and deep way. You don't just read Newman on a casual whim as a summer beach reading, do you? You have to really give yourself over in a way. But it's not just an intellectual affair, as Newman's own motto would suggest. I
can attest to that because in my own life, I was studying to be a Protestant pastor. So I was at Duke Divinity School in Durham, North Carolina, and I stumbled across an essay by Rusty Reno, who taught at Creighton for some time. He's now the editor of First Things. And he wrote about his own conversion, but he quoted Newman in these writings. He talks some about Newman's understanding of the development of doctrine. But there's a phrase that Newman gave when he wrote this essay where he says, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. Now, in our own ecumenical context, that sounds a little harsh, a little blunt, and Newman goes on to unpack precisely what he means. But he does sincerely believe that there's this continuity between the church and its early phase, the church as it was founded by Jesus Christ and then carried on by the apostles, and the Catholic Church today. When I read this, I knew I couldn't just walk away from that phrase. I had to investigate the claim for myself. So that led me into a serious engagement with patristic literature with the early church fathers, but also with the writings of Newman. So the great thing about Newman's theology is, again, it's not arid or dry in an intellectual sense. He really believes something serious is at stake. He's not trying to pad his resume. So to read his writings, it costs something from yourself because you can't walk away from them and say, well, to each his own. Newman makes something at stake. Yeah.
If you believe that and it's good for you, then that's fine. No, he's making a claim. And this cost him, right, his own process. He was a devoted Christian, Anglican, but the attraction to the Catholic Church was a process that unfolded, but brought him some opprobrium from people.
Yeah, so Newman was a prominent Anglican minister, and I've talked on our own show that this is somewhat difficult for us to think about today because, theology, I don't think most Americans make a beeline to the theology section of the bookstore or whatnot. But Newman,
if they do, it's something very different than what we might understand.
That's right. It's maybe something New Agey. But Newman, the person who I would compare him to in the American context was kind of Billy Graham, and not in his preaching or something like that, but just someone who was very well known in the Church of England. He was a leader of the Oxford movement, which was a movement to try to return Anglicanism to its Catholic roots. Like, in a nutshell, he sort of wanted to re-Catholicize Anglicanism. But his sermons actually sold quite well, too. So he has 8 volumes of Anglican sermons called the Parochial and Plain Sermons, and he used those to fund his own ministry. So many Englanders, who were literate would buy his sermons and read them as devotional reading. So when he converted to the Catholic faith, this was big news. This was front page news, sort of like the most prominent minister in the land converting. And at the time, so I said in our own ecumenical context earlier, England was less ecumenical. On Guy Fawkes Day, the people of England would burn the Pope in effigy, and and some parts of England, Roman Catholic priests were not allowed to wear clerics out in public. So there was this sort of prejudice against Roman Catholicism. And when Newman converted, it wasn't simply that he was converting to another faith, but he was becoming less British, so to speak. So it was a big deal.
The Romanism.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
And do we see evidence of that there was a crucible for him, or that is that just he doesn't give us that glimpse into his own soul and whatever trials he was experiencing there?
It was a crucible. In one of his letters, he said that by 1841, so in the early 1840s, he said he was on his deathbed as an Anglican. At that point, he knew it was going to be difficult, if not impossible, to continue in conscience to be an Anglican minister. So he withdrew to a little town outside of Oxford called Littlemore, and he basically set up, when I visited, it reminded me very much of like a Benedictine monastery. So he was already living sort of a Catholic life, but he didn't actually convert until 1845. When I visited, I was very moved. So there were many factors in his conversion, but one of them was this serious wrestling with the faith. And the last question that he had to ask is he thought that there were corruptions in Roman Catholicism. So he was impressed with the liturgy and with the apostolicity of many things that Catholics taught and said, but he thought there were elements of the faith that, like the strong Marian devotion or something like that, he's like, I don't see that exactly in some of these early writings. So he wrote this important essay on the development of doctrine where he says the apostolic faith, or the deposit that Christ gave to the apostles, is sort of like an acorn, and it grows into this great tree. And it changes over time, but its essence does not, right? It grows and develops, and we gain this deeper understanding of the faith. But in its proper form, it's still the same thing. Well, he wrote this essay at Littlemore on a writing desk, and at some point, he actually stopped the essay. It's sort of unfinished. If you read it, you're like, oh, it's really wrapping up right now, right here. But when he stopped the essay, he reached out to now blessed Dominic Barberi, and he was received into the faith on October 9th, 1845. I like the story of his actual conversion because he started his confession in the evening and wrapped it up in the morning. And as someone who came into the Catholic faith like in my late 20s, I'm like, I can see how that first confession is sort of harrowing.
That would be an integral confession, I think, yes.
But what's really cool is he took that writing table and he turned the top over a bit and then used that to celebrate his first Mass. Or actually, I should say that Dominic Barberi celebrated Mass on that table. And so today it's almost like a first-class relic. It's been consecrated in a sense. And he went from this writing himself into the faith to incorporation into the mystical body of Christ.
So not to get too, into the academic ether here, but in development of doctrine, would he have looked to Vincent of Lorraine as one of his sources to inspire him? Yeah.
So Vincent of Lorraine, today we talk about the Vincentian canon, which is what is to be believed is what was taught everywhere by everyone and at all times. Meaning in the early church, if we see this teaching of the faith that spreads across like the known world and is taught by many fathers, that is to be believed. It's interesting, Bishop, in the essay on the development of doctrine, Newman says, I really held to this as an Anglican because I thought antiquity is on our side. He actually begins to see some challenges with the Vincentian canon where he says, it's wonderful in theory, but it's difficult to apply. And he talks about, so how many fathers do you have to see it in and how many regions? Mm-hmm. And so he doesn't dismiss the Vincentian canon, but where he lands is with a quote by Augustine, Securat iudice, I'm gonna butcher it here, Securat, it doesn't matter in the Latin. He says, the whole world rests secure in its judgment. And what Newman means by that is when the Catholic Church as a body spread across the world makes a judgment about a matter of faith, that's what's binding on us. Mm-hmm. And Catholicity is sort of the church reaching that judgment, and we trust the church as the body founded by Jesus Christ.
Okay, so we still have a couple minutes, and I think we could do this somewhat efficiently. But we think about the doctrines of the Immaculate Conception, the Assumption; those are very frequent examples. He was well respected, was in good graces with the Holy Father. So the Vatican I Council, which in 1870, and the whole doctrine of papal infallibility. What was his relationship vis-a-vis Vatican I and his non-participation there?
Yeah, so he was invited by more than one bishop to attend the council, and he chose not to. He didn't consider himself a theologian. I don't have to get into that too much, but he thought that theologians had this proper training where they could grab the sources of the faith really quickly. He's like, that's not really me. I've written more like occasional essays on specific topics. But he was, to be frank, he was sort of nervous about what was going on at the council. And the main thing is that there were some figures in the Curia, in the church, who had a very elevated understanding of papal authority, where even what the Pope said at the dinner table, or about every issue, the Holy Father tends to speak not only on doctrinal matters, but sometimes about politics or social issues. And Newman said, well, if we look at how the authority of the Pope has operated throughout history, there's really specific criteria or cases where we say this statement is actually infallible and to be trusted like it could never be reformed. And Newman said those are rare, and there's very specific criteria. So when Vatican I affirmed that the Pope could speak in that manner, Newman did not reject that teaching, but he said, well, now it's up to us to be careful in how we apply it or go about it. And I think that's good. I think, as committed Catholics, we look to the Holy Father as a pastor and as our spiritual father. we do have to have this proper discernment where, obviously, like, say an encyclical, that has this kind of, like, elevated authority, and we look to that as an expression of our teaching and of our Catholic faith. We don't have to get in a tizzy about each papal interview, or, there's sort of like a nuance there, and I think it was important for Newman to speak to that.
So when the Pope comes to the back of the plane on a visit and just kind of lets his hair down with the reporters, how the New York Times may trumpet that, but that is not necessarily that. But very interesting considerations in an era of synodality and the ongoing synod there. But we must take a pause.
Stay with us as we continue our conversation with Dr. Bud Marr, our resident Newman scholar. And if you want to read some of Newman's writings, go online to newmanreader.org. You're listening to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen on Iowa Catholic Radio and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network. Welcome back to Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen.
I'll be spurred to further reflection about the standard of the development of doctrine. What the German Church does not necessarily obtain for the Universal Catholic Church in that way, and that'll be a tension we have to live through in this way too. But the Newman trajectory, even in recent decade, has really taken off in so many ways. Our U.S. bishops this past November at our plenary fall meeting voted in concert with the UK bishops, who asked us if we would be willing to support his recognition as a doctor of the Church. Yeah. This for a man who really wasn't even beatified and canonized until recent years.
Yeah. He has taken off. It's been astounding. I came to the National Institute for Newman Studies at a really exciting, I would think, providential time in my own life and in the life of the Church. But there's a few factors, Bishop. Newman wrote on so much. He lived from 1801 to 1890, so God blessed him with a lot of time. He was able to edit a lot of his writings, sort of like St. Augustine. So on matters of justification, on conscience, on prayer and personal discipleship, Newman wrote on all those things. But he wrote in English. At the time, a lot of Catholic theology was written in Latin. And of course, today, English is becoming the lingua franca, or what's
pun intended.
Yeah, most spoken around the world. And so there's a real accessibility to Newman's writings, but also a lot of the topics that he wrote about. So we ended with, church authority, which is in a lot of people's minds today. He wrote about the different offices of the Church, like the priestly, prophetic office, and how those interact. And so on education, he's a presence through these Newman Centers. For all these reasons, I think more and more folks are interested in diving into his writings. And then with Pope Benedict beatifying him and Francis canonizing him, Newman's in the water. So it's a great thing right now.
That heart speaks to heart. You made reference to conscience. He's often cited there and wielded maybe by some, the pitting conscience against the Church, against the tradition of faith and morals, and, that informed conscience. Could you comment on that, why he would be a worthy doctor of conscience but understood properly?
Yeah, so when someone's named a doctor of the Church, sometimes they're named a doctor of a specific topic or matter, and some theologians have said, well, maybe Newman will be the doctor of conscience because he wrote some really important pieces on this topic. Newman, he did uphold and believed in the primacy of conscience, meaning a person could not act against their own conscience. To do so would make the moral life unintelligible, because you'd be thinking something was wrong and still doing it, or right and then not following your conscience. So he says, this is foundational to living a moral life. But he did warn against what he called counterfeit conscience. He says, in our own day, especially outside of the Church, there are writers who talk about conscience as the right of self-will. And so Newman, sort of as a precursor to Pope Benedict, and I think Benedict was drawing on Newman's writings, said, yes, we have the primacy of conscience, but we also have the duty, especially as Catholics, to form our consciences rightly. And so we look to the Church. We look to our mentors, especially those who have gone before us in the faith, and those are necessary resources to form our conscience so that when we do follow it, we're following the voice of God and not our own subjective self-will.
Yeah, and maybe an analogy there, obliquely you're talking about the papal infallibility. An ultramontanist view would see the Pope's authority transcending all things and trumping, if you will, or superseding anything else. People can do that, infuse conscience with that, and make it the supreme and solitary authority.
Yeah, Newman said that the Pope or church authorities are not oracles, like they don't receive these direct revelations of God that they just give out.
I'm still waiting for mine.
Yeah, we are as well. But the Church is the great upholder of conscience, because for the Church to say anything against conscience would be sawing off the limb upon which it sits. And the church believes that as persons follow their conscience and as they do what's right, they're actually being drawn ever closer to God, and that opens their eyes to the truths of the faith.
That inner sanctuary where we meet God face to face.
Newman called it the aboriginal vicar of Christ. It's the place where we first hear the voice of God in our lives.
So much to ponder, and thank you. I think you've spurred me to delve into Newman this year. So thank you for taking time.
Thank you so much.
Hopefully the break gives you a chance to be reinvigorated as you head into a new semester, Dr. Marr.
I appreciate it.
Well, this has been another edition of Making It Personal with Bishop Joensen. Thank you to our guests and to all of our listeners in Iowa and Nebraska, Wisconsin, or wherever you may be listening to Iowa Catholic Radio and the Spirit Catholic Radio Network.
You can hear Making It Personal with Bishop William Joensen every week on Iowa Catholic Radio and iowacatholicradio.com.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and Making It Personal is provided by Sarah Vocations Ministry. Learn more at joinserra.org.